Well, good evening. My name is Joe Coletti, and I serve the College of Ag and Life Sciences as a Senior Associate Dean and have been a host of Dr. Carl Brooks today and his sidekick, Josh Savati. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carl Brooks. He's the Administrator for Region 7 of the Environmental Protection Agency. He supervises the EPA operations for Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and 9 tribal nations. He's been a member of the University of Kansas faculty for the past 13 years, and he's taught there American environmental, political, and legal history and environmental law and policy. He's written 3 books, one of which is entitled Before Earth Day, The Origins of American Environmental Law, 1945 to 1970. And he's also well published in scholarly journals, magazines, and newspaper print as well. Before earning his doctorate at the University of Kansas, Dr. Brooks was a trial lawyer and state senator for his home state of Idaho. He was elected 3 terms to the Idaho Senate, and he also served as the executive director and legislative liaison for the Iowa Conservation League, the state's largest citizen environmental organization. So the environment kind of runs in your blood, I guess, in a sense. Dr. Brooks and his wife Mary are the parents of 3 college-age children, one of which I know is a forester in training at the University of Montana. I happen to be a forester too, so that rang true. And he does have some ties to Iowa. Turns out that his father's ancestors were in fact in Iowa and then for some reason moved to Nebraska, but maybe that improved Nebraska at the same time in the 1880s, and that's where his grandmother was born. The College of Agriculture and Life Sciences is very pleased to help sponsor tonight's lecture, along with the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the government of the student bodies. So Dr. Brooks is speaking to us tonight. The title of his presentation is Private Lands and Public Priorities, the EPA, Iowa Agriculture, and the Quest for Land Health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carl Brooks.
Hey, good evening. Thank you very much for coming here. I listened to Joe's introduction and thought, that all sounds good, and then I realized that he'd placed me at the head of the Iowa Conservation League, and I didn't remember that. I'm actually the former director of the Idaho Conservation League, that other I state. So, the Iowa roots are all true, but it was the Idaho experience. I really appreciate everybody joining us here tonight. I want to thank Dean Winterstein for hosting me here. I want to acknowledge the sponsor, the government of the student body of Iowa State University, and President Jared Knight and his team for making this lecture series available. And I also want to thank President Stephen Leith from Iowa State for inviting me to join this long tradition that Iowa State has of engaging not just the university community and not just Ames, but the whole state in vital public topics that affect every Iowan, and certainly this topic does. Huge pleasure to be a guest of Iowa State University, which is the alma mater of this state's elected Agriculture and Land Stewardship Secretary Bill Northey. And the Environmental Protection Agency, especially here in the Heartland, has had a long and distinguished and close relationship with ISU. You educated both of my immediate predecessors. Both of the regional administrators of Region 7 are Cyclone alums. John Askew, the class of 82, and Jim Gulliford, class of 75. So thank you, Cyclones, for supplying a steady stream of leadership talent to EPA in the Heartland. I also want to acknowledge my good friend Chuck Gipp in the crowd here. Chuck's a director of the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, but alas, a Luther College alum. So sorry about that. So it's early March. It's about 2 weeks before midterms. Several students knew exactly how long it was until spring break and midterms. I'm in a lecture hall. I've got notes in front of me. Mic is live. All eyes are on me except you two in the back who are texting. I see you doing that. Stop that right now. And it's just like being back in the classroom at KU, except I see a lot more gray hair, and I don't see nearly as many pairs of Ugg boots. And I think that I see 2 upside-down Jayhawks plucked and wearing referee shirts hanging just outside the Great Hall. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. I left the faculty of the University of Kansas 57 days before that refereeing malfunction. I bear no responsibility for what happened out there at all. So I see a lot of undergrads here. I'm really pleased about that. If you're here for the extra credit, I promise this talk is going to be a lot more interesting than your other option of outlining 2 scholarly journal articles. I'm going to do my very best, and nothing that I cover tonight is going to be on the midterm, so don't sweat that. I'm really glad that there are students here, both undergrads, some I recognize from earlier today, as well as graduate students. You're the future of Iowa's agriculture, and I expect you probably know that. I appreciate my Hawkeye friends in Iowa City. I often go over to the University of Iowa there, but in agriculture, America's agricultural homeland, I think it's only appropriate that ISU should enroll more students than the University of Iowa. Yes, congratulations. And that enrollment strength illustrates how agriculture and technology are reshaping Iowa's and America's environmental future. The machines that you invent, the new systems that you perfect, they should sustain the natural world on which we ultimately depend for all our food. That's why the challenge that I want to visit with you about tonight is one of the most important questions facing Iowa, Iowans, and Iowa agriculture. So yesterday, if you noticed, President Obama nominated the person who I hope and believe will be the next EPA administrator, my colleague Gina McCarthy, who's been our air pollution director for the last 4 years. Our first administrator during my time with the agency, Lisa Jackson, just recently completed her service. Lisa was here in Iowa in 2011. She and Ag Secretary Tom Vilsack came for a couple of days, and we went really all over central Iowa. We toured a cattle feeding operation in Marion County. We went to a biodiesel refinery in Jasper County, and then we spent several hours at one of the world's most advanced corn farms outside Prairie City. It was really wet and really cold, typical April day in Iowa. People in Iowa were incredibly warm toward Administrator Jackson. And when she got back to D.C., what she saw and what she heard down on the farm prompted her to write a long and very, I think, interesting and important column in the Des Moines Register the next week. I suggest that you read that column. It was written about 2 years ago, but the message that Administrator Jackson had about Iowa agriculture and about environmental quality and about the EPA is an enduring message. Administrator Jackson and Secretary Vilsack spotlighted the dynamic relationship that links Iowa farmers and the EPA to this state's rich soil and abundant waters. EPA's leader singled out American agriculture as one of this country's most flexible, dynamic, and innovative enterprises, and she saluted Iowa's 90,000 farmers as among our country's most dedicated land stewards. I'd also encourage you, after you've taken a look at that column, to study EPA's record in this state. For over 40 years here in the heartland, this agency has promoted many of the changes made by responsible farmers who know they help feed the world best by safeguarding our priceless land heritage. This dynamic partnership that Administrator Jackson talked about between agricultural innovation, land stewardship, and environmental quality does have its rough spots. Not everything that the Congress has directed the EPA to do pleases every Iowa ag producer, and sometimes, I got to admit, my Region 7 colleagues and I have made decisions that have caused some frustration here. But this agency's enduring mission to protect public health and environmental security dovetails with producers' own goals: to raise this nation's food, forage, fiber, and fuel prosperously, productively, and responsibly. When the EPA does its job right, then Iowa agriculture wins. And when Iowa farmers responsibly conserve the long-term health of their land, they secure the future of their communities. Caring for the health of our land epitomizes responsibility. It requires hard thinking and practical action so the generations who follow us can make their home in this place that we call our home. Iowa's agricultural commitment to secure the future in turn inspires the EPA to do what I think we have always done best. We collaborate, we innovate, and we encourage. This agency has regulatory duties, but it also enjoys opportunities, and I want to discuss such an opportunity with you here tonight. It's EPA's campaign, spearheaded by the state ag and environmental agencies, to enlist independent Iowa farmers to tackle this nation's and this state's biggest unsolved pollution problem. That's the nutrient-laden water that has no specific point source, but instead flows from many places into Iowa's broad blue braid of waters. I'm honored, extremely honored, that Iowa State, which by most measures is this nation's most influential land-grant institution, has invited me, a non-farmer, non-engineer, to visit with you tonight about cutting pollution caused by raising crops and livestock. I know no better place to launch this campaign and explain what we are trying to do than what Iowa's preeminent ag journalist Ken Root has called America's Mesopotamia. Ken's happy phrase, America's Mesopotamia, about Iowa evokes what the science has well established. Iowa cradles this continent's two greatest rivers. So all your waters here, all of them, ultimately drain either into the Missouri or the Mississippi. What leaves your farms from Sioux City to Dubuque ultimately ends up in the greatest river of the nation and ultimately goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. I spent today on campus with your amazing students, grads and undergrads, with teachers and with researchers. Their curiosity and their energy vindicate what I think are this country's two most ambitious educational initiatives. The most recent was the GI Bill, enacted at the end of World War II and then renewed for each generation of veterans. The GI Bill opened doors. Public money gave ordinary men and women a chance that had been denied for generations, and that was to get a higher education. Both my dad and my uncle were Army veterans. Both of them attended college at the University of Idaho only because of the GI Bill. Before 1945, the cost of college and the social snobbery about college would have prevented them and most of their friends from ever getting a higher education. After 1945, higher education in America has never been what it was for the first 250 years of our experience of finishing school for the elites. Now, America's land-grant institutions, like ISU, have never been country clubs, and that's because of our first great national educational initiative, the land-grant college, pioneered in 1862. The land-grant experiment changed this nation. It not only democratized college, so sons and daughters too of ordinary farmers could attend college. It elevated thinking about agriculture into a national imperative. Land-grant knowledge has propelled this nation's agricultural output to world leadership in just 2 generations after the concept first appeared here. Today, Iowa State educates the Iowans and citizens of the globe who will become responsible for perfecting the seeds, growing the crops, and innovating the next generation of food systems. By most measurements, Iowa State has become the world's most influential agricultural research and teaching institution. You know, America's greatest modern conservation was an Iowa native who spent his entire scholarly career at a land-grant university. I mean Aldo Leopold, of course. Over 3 decades across the river at the University of Wisconsin, Leopold developed a broad view of what he called land health. By land health, he meant not just better dirt, but a better natural and social complex that links soil, water, people, and plants. Leopold's generous view of land health offers a challenge worthy of our best efforts. and it inspires the EPA's partnership with Iowa farmers and your ag and your environmental agencies. And I'm here to tell you tonight that our quest for land health depends on land grant institutions. It depends on you performing your mission here. Why? Because land grant institutions like Iowa State understand that building the best agricultural system is too important to leave to chance and to tradition. How we use our land to grow our food is a public policy problem. It's not just an exercise in economics or engineering or even science. This perennial problem of land health and food security deserves our best thinking, and solving that problem requires Iowa State and Iowa farmers to think hard about topics that are at the heart of the American experience, like democracy, self-government, the market, and security. There are still some sophisticates who I think are really ignorant, who call land-grant institutions cow colleges. To me, they're not cow colleges. They're laboratories for self-government and innovation. They're laboratories of responsibility. Now, to realize the founder's vision of the land grant, I think cyclones have to study about more than just agriculture, because agriculture involves things like property, law, science, nature, technology, and the very messy, very frustrating daily business of self-government. Along with the mechanical and the technical arts and skills, Iowa State trains leadership. Whether you study or teach here, or share your work across Iowa through extension, you accept the proposition that how we raise our food is as much a political project requiring decisions made all across Iowa as it is a scientific and a managerial challenge. If you wonder what I mean about Iowa State educating leaders and training leadership, take a look at this state's leadership roster since about 1880. Look at the number of Cyclones who've held the governorship. Look at the number of Iowa State alums who've represented this state in the halls of Congress. Look at the membership roster of the Iowa legislature and the leadership of the state's political, legal, and business sectors for over 125 years. And many of the leadership lessons that they learned right here in Ames. And then they carried them home, whether their home was a small town in northeastern Iowa, or whether it was off to Des Moines, or to Washington, D.C., and today increasingly around the globe. Cyclones should ask hard questions and test new answers about food and society, about responsibility and innovation, and about agricultural productivity and environmental quality. And to get those answers, you've got to apply your good sense and your civic values and your sense of responsibility that have been honed here over 6 generations. I'd say that the hardest question now before all of us in this room tonight, and everybody who's part of the land grant mission here, is this. How should Iowans mesh their energy, their experience, and their values to solve the problem of water pollution caused by agricultural production in ways that make our land healthier, our communities more prosperous, and our natural systems more resilient and productive? Many of the answers are going to be found right here at ISU. You and your partners in Iowa agriculture hold the key to unlock the solutions to this grave problem. What's that key? It's human curiosity. It's the very quality that drew you here tonight through the wind and the snow. It's the very quality that impelled you to become a cyclone. It's that sense of human curiosity. It propels innovation. It stimulates reconsideration of things that we once thought we understood perfectly. It constantly demands new ways of thinking about a task as old as human civilization. How do we feed the people? How do we conserve the soil? How do we take care of the biota that, working all together, yield our daily bread? So Iowa agriculture innovates, and it innovates in some pretty sophisticated, awesome places, and it also innovates in some pretty ordinary places. Quiet laboratory, where a botanist is at work. A damp greenhouse, where someone's trying to unlock the prairie's power. Sometimes in a small office that's got absolutely no scientific equipment at all. But you have an economist, a sociologist, and a historian trying to figure out why it is that Iowans from cities and Iowans from small towns sometimes look at food and nature in such different ways. And I'd have to tell you, too, that Iowa agriculture innovation sometimes happens in a Crossroads Cafe in a small town and in a livestock barn. Because in a couple of those characteristic places of Iowa life, there were little events that I think you'll see multiplied over time and spread across space that should enlist Iowa producers and Iowa manufacturers and Iowa engineers in a historic commitment to safeguard Iowa and American water. So let me take you to the Crossroads Cafe. 2 springs ago, Bill Northey, the Ag Secretary of Iowa, and I met in Osceola, and over the best BLT that I have ever eaten, Bill and I started planning how we could enlist both the state ag department and the Environmental Protection Agency and Iowa agriculture, broadly defined, in a heartland campaign to cut water pollution. The goal had earlier been identified by state agencies all through the Mississippi Basin, working with federal agencies like EPA. And that goal is this: to cut by 45% the nitrogen and the phosphorus that Iowa's many rivers discharge into this nation's greatest river, the Mississippi. Now, the science about nutrient pollution is largely undisputed. It fouls our drinking water from rivers and wells. It degrades the aquatic life that nourishes our fish and our waterfowl. It sickens swimmers, and it's choking America's productive marine fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. I spent a little time today in the laboratory, your limnology laboratory here, with Dr. Downing and some of his students. And just spending a little bit of time with them brings you right up close to the challenges that nutrient pollution poses, not just in the Gulf, and not just in the lower Mississippi, but right here in the state of Iowa. The facts also show that much, although not all, but much of this nutrient pollution comes from America's heartland. Not just Iowa, of course. Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, wherever we raise these crops here, these prodigious yields of corn and beans. Now, the dimensions of nutrient pollution are also largely undisputed. Most nitrogen and phosphorus comes from hundreds of thousands of sources: lawns, farms, livestock pens, along with treated water that comes out of our city and small town sewer plants. We in the environmental protection business call that non-point source pollution. And for over 40 years, since this nation enacted the Clean Water Act, it has defied our best efforts to solve that problem. But the time has come to try to make a serious effort to solve it. Fortunately, a lot of the tools and the techniques that we need are right here in Ames. Sure, I mean things like cropping practices, chemistry, but I mean more than that too. Iowans will only lead the way in tackling this nation's greatest unsolved water pollution problem by drawing on the deep reserves of common sense and community and compromise that Iowa State, like every good land-grant institution, has built up in this state's farmers and leaders over the past 150 years. So, over that BLT lunch in Osceola, Bill and I committed both of our agencies, IDALS, the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, as well as EPA, and then we were ultimately able to enlist the Department of Natural Resources and a host of other state and federal agencies in a commitment to steadily, measurably reduce nutrient pollution. And some of your scientists here, agronomists, hydrologists, botanists, extension specialists, have already begun taking that political pledge that we made and translating that into a practical program. Back in late November, Governor Branstad announced Iowa's draft strategy to cut nutrient pollution. All of us recognize, those who designed it and those who have to make it work, as well as most Iowans, that it's a start. We recognize that it's a start. But the Iowa strategy offers something of great value, something that hardly any other heartland state has done to tackle water pollution caused by land use. Iowa's strategy is deploying scientific principles and practical research to outline a common-sense menu of farming and land use practices. If and when, and I'm going to emphasize the when, robustly applied by Iowa's over 90,000 farmers, these practices have been demonstrated to bend down the nutrient pollution curve. Iowa State faculty like Matt Helmers, Tom Eisenhart, and John Lawrence helped develop these practices and helped assemble them into a menu of practices that producers can use. Essentially what they were asking is, how can Iowa farmers grow this state's signature crops, especially corn and soybeans, at a profit in ways that better hold nitrogen and phosphorus where they belong, in the plants and in the soil, not in the creeks, not in the sloughs, and not in the rivers that lace this state into America's two greatest rivers. And then throughout the winter, extension specialists from Iowa State have been sharing the nutrient strategy and these practices at county meetings all over the state. I heard today in meeting with the science team that nearly 2,000 Iowans have commented on the plan. Iowans are outspoken about things they care about. Iowans are good citizens. When they have a view about something, they speak right up. And thousands of farmers and farm owners and managers have attended these winter meetings here. ISU, working with IDALS and the DNR, are trying now to take these comments to tune and improve the strategy. Even before it becomes final, even before the nutrient control strategy becomes a final document, Secretary Northey has challenged Iowa farmers to implement several of these practices right now for the 2013 season. The president of the Iowa Farm Bureau, Craig Hill, has challenged his members and given them the same call to action. Governor Branstad has asked the legislature to appropriate over $2 million to promote these new farming practices that conserve soil health and revive water quality. And my agency is not unaware of the significance of these commitments. We do not underestimate the importance of these commitments. That's why this chance to talk with you tonight comes at such a good time. We at the Environmental Protection Agency are committed to working with farmers and livestock operators to support their mission to grow food in better ways, ways that will revive our land, clean our water, and honor our communities. We can only make these measurable cuts. We can only attain this goal, this ambitious goal of a 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus, by deploying our initiative and by teaming our distinctive duties, because we have different jobs at EPA than Chuck's DNR has, and Chuck's DNR has different jobs than IDALS, and Iowa State has a different job than its counterparts at Iowa City. But working in an ag partnership with the EPA is critical to accomplishing this. But partnership with EPA is not without its perils in Iowa. And let me share one of those perils with you. Remember that livestock barn where I said a little bit of ag history happened? This is a funny story about me and Iowa ag producers. So last summer I'm at the state fair. Had a really great day there. Chuck and the governor and Bill Northey honored me by asking me to join them in presenting Iowa's first Governor's Farmer Environmental Leader Awards. 100 different farm families came across the stage there. They got their plaque. They shook hands with the governor and Chuck and Bill and then finally me. And I was really pleased that a number of them said, quietly, these are Iowans, but they said, thank you very much for being here. We don't see EPA all that often. It's really good to see that you care about what we're trying to do. And I appreciated that because usually Iowa producers are not welcoming of EPA when we come here. So it was really nice to have that exchange. The evening before, I'd had a different kind of conversation about EPA and Iowa agriculture. So I'm walking through the sheep barn, and I'm with a couple of my colleagues, some from Region 7, some from headquarters. I'm a city kid. I know next to nothing about raising sheep, but it was really cool. I was kind of admiring the lambs and the ewes and the rams, and I noticed that a lot of the lambs had what looked to me like jackets on, even though it was in August. And so I stopped at one of the pens. It was kind of a warm evening. There was a nice lady sitting there in a folding chair. And I said, excuse me, I see that your lamb is kind of wearing a coat or a jacket. What's up with that? And very politely, she looked at me, and I was wearing an EPA shirt, and she looked at the EPA crest, and she said, why does EPA want to know? So right there, you see one of the challenges that this agency has in partnering with Iowa agriculture. Many farmers and livestock producers remain skeptical, that's putting it mildly, about EPA's objectives and motives and methods. Now, we are not without our supporters. Nearly 3 million Iowans depend on EPA working with our state partner to take care that their drinking water is safe, that their air is healthful, and that the chemicals they use, whether to grow food or to paint their house, are potent but protective. But I get it. Environmental protection through common sense regulation still provokes discussion and some resistance among Iowans. Some who raise food, forage, fiber, and fuel criticize the work that EPA and the DNR do. I've heard it called at meetings just like this and other places, heavy-handed government interference. I've heard it called interference with my private rights and liberties, and I've heard it called big government at its worst. So let me just respond to the critics this way. The nutrient control strategy that I'm talking with you about tonight reflects something basic about the way that Iowans live. It's this: neighbors expect neighbors to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. Some Iowans express their commitment to responsibility by doing research in the labs. They research better methods to grow food for their neighbors. Other Iowans express responsibility in the field. They share these new ideas with producers, and they hear their constructive criticism. Sometimes we show responsibility by choosing to direct our individual energy and initiative toward the community's longer-term stability and prosperity. The Congress of the United States made a very basic choice when it enacted the Clean Water in 1972. The Act says that pollution caused by private agricultural land use is to be primarily remedied through local decisions, and mostly often by private actions. Now, that's a fundamental difference in the Clean Water Act between the way we treat what we call point source pollution, where you can see it's coming out of a pipe into a stream or a lake or a river. Might be a factory, might be a sewage treatment plant. There's a thick web of law and regulations that limit how those point sources discharge pollution. And those point sources can also include certain kinds of livestock confinements. But when it comes to non-point source pollution, from a corn farm, let's say, the Clean Water Act uses very different tools than that thick web of laws and regulations. It primarily enlists science, market forces, and individual choices to grow food more responsibly. This agency can help steer those forces, and over 40-some years we have invested billions of dollars. And our partner agencies like USDA have invested hundreds of billions of dollars to encourage land and water conservation on Iowa farms. Rarely, though, if ever, has this agency commanded action using the discipline of the law on farming choices that affect land use. Livestock production in confined operations, it's a different legal matter. They're treated, if they meet certain qualifications, more like a point source from a factory or a sewage plant. They have to obtain permits, almost always from the DNR. But that's because these methods of food production can, if not properly managed, in accordance with that web of laws and regulation, discharge pollutants into America's waters. That's why we continue to partner with the DNR and with the livestock industry in Iowa to make Iowa's CAFO permitting program the best in the nation. We've got a ways to go, but we're working on that partnership. Now, a CAFO permit is one form of responsibility. It's a legal responsibility. It's a responsibility to manage further damage to the waters of this state, which the Iowa Constitution declares belong for the benefit of all the people. And like all legal responsibilities, permits under the Clean Water Act generate a steady stream of dialogue, disagreement, negotiation, and further lawmaking, and that's as it should be. For the community has decided by making those laws to use authority to restrain private action, to advance the common good by protecting our health and safety, and to protect the safety of folks who don't have the legal means to protect their own health and safety. We know that observing those CAFO permits takes time and it costs money. The statistics and facts demonstrate that this investment, though, has been a smart one for Iowa and for the nation. Nutrient pollution, though, it's a different issue legally, practically, and politically. The EPA must and does respect Congress's considered policy choice in 1972 to limit and to reduce this form of water pollution using the same smarts and savvy and vision that drain the prairies and grow the row crops that feed the world. Which brings me back to the land-grant mission. Brings me back here to Iowa State and to Ames. The founders of this university were visionaries. They understood right from the outset that land-grant colleges occupied a strategic nexus of extraordinary power. You command vast public resources at this university, and your counterparts across the heartland do the same. You educate our citizens, including our young. In return for discharging these great responsibilities, the land-grant institution in turn owes the community substantial service. About Iowa State's heritage of agricultural innovation, little need be said tonight. You know, just by walking down the halls and looking at the banners and seeing the displays, what this university has meant over the last 150 years to Iowa and to this country. Your innovations have changed the world, literally. Iowa State innovations have turned this state into an agricultural engine that would have astounded the founders of Iowa State. Now, agricultural innovation requires you to carefully investigate and clearly understand Iowa's place here in the heartland. Making agricultural innovation serve the perennial quest for land health requires an even closer understanding of how we take individual initiative and action on farms and ranches and then shape the community's need and mesh with the community's need for prosperity, health, and security. So Iowa's commitment to substantially cutting nutrient pollution that harms both Des Moines' drinking water as well as shrimp fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico, that reflects a fundamental sense of responsibility. It's that responsibility that makes a farmer invest in tools and practices so that his family can operate the place long after he retires. That's the responsibility that encourages his lender to invest in farming changes that may take a little bit more time to repay. That's the responsibility that inspires a drainage district here in Iowa to promote techniques that harness innovations to achieve newer goals. That's the same sense of responsibility that should convince Iowa agricultural leaders to step forward, to urge their neighbors to look beyond their fence lines, and to appreciate that what's good for Story County is good for St. Bernard Parish down in Louisiana. Sure, no one is under any illusions. Fixing our waterways by improving our farms will take time. But you Iowans have been understanding your climate and studying your soil and raising your sites here for over 150 years. You've proved that over time, responsible people make better decisions when they understand the facts. Just as Iowa farmers have raised food for more than just private profit, so the lessons that Iowa State has taught for 6 generations about community service, about popular government, about land stewardship, and about human creativity will serve this state well in this partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency to tackle this country's largest unsolved pollution problem. Get to work. It's time to start. Thank you very much. Okay, so now I've sort of been talking at you for 30-some minutes here, about 35 minutes, and what Wendy and Joe and I wanted to do is to see if we can have a little bit more of a conversation with you. So Joe's got a hand mic. There's a stand mic there at the intersection of the room. Happy to try to respond to your questions or comments. Would appreciate almost anything that you want to share with us tonight about this effort and other EPA efforts in the state. So let's have at it. Yes, sir. Yeah, I can hear you too. I couldn't tell with the LSU sweatshirt there. One of the steps along that way is for folks who live at the lower reaches of the Mississippi River to accept that they too contribute to nutrient pollution that's fouling the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, our agricultural engine here in the United States is pretty vast. The state of Mississippi and state of Arkansas and Tennessee also have their own contributions to make, so those states also are part of this effort to cut nutrient pollution. When it comes to looking beyond your state's boundaries, so in Iowa, caring about what happens in Louisiana, one of the places to start is to recognize that nutrient pollution, while it's a big problem in your home state, it's a problem for those of us here in the heartland too. It's a problem for Iowans too. So that it's not just somebody else down the river's problem. It's a problem that starts right here with our waters. That's, I think, the beginning of the understanding that our actions have consequences, and those consequences can go 1,200 miles down the Mississippi River. Another thing I think that probably is going to happen throughout the course of this effort is that the impact of nutrient pollution on the lower Mississippi and on the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to become more apparent to folks here in the heartland, in the entire Corn Belt, from Ohio clear out to Nebraska, that actions here have consequences down there. Work of scientists, and I think work of members of the media too, are going to be really important to promoting that understanding that something that happens here in Story County ultimately has some downrange impacts. So, I mean, one of the strengths of this effort is that it's enlisted every state that drains into the Mississippi River Basin and the key federal agencies like the EPA and USDA in this effort. There is, though, this sense of responsibility of understanding what I do on my property has impact downrange on my neighbors. But I'd have to think that we are there, at least at a certain basic level. Translating that into action here in the state, that's going to be the challenge. But I hope, because you're a Louisianan and you share these kinds of stories with folks here in Iowa, they'll pay attention because they probably like you and respect you, and when you tell them stories about how it affects your neighbors and your family in Louisiana, that matters. It puts a human face on these things. Yeah, thank you. Oh, surely I didn't answer every single question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the nutrient strategy, and we all know that science assessment at least has been released. What do you envision the role that EPA will play in the future regarding the Iowa nutrient strategy?
A couple of things that we are doing right now is working with all the different partners in the federal government. Primarily those partners are the different parts of the United States Department of Agriculture, whether it's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, Farm Security Agency, FSA, the Agricultural Research Service. I mean, I think folks should expect that the federal government, at a minimum, will get its own powers into alignment on this, so that what we're trying to do at EPA to work with IDALs, the DNR, and Iowans will match and reflect what NRCS is doing with Iowa producers. One of the things that gives me a lot of confidence that this effort is off to a start that matters is that the state conservationist here in Iowa, Jay Marr, some of you may have met Jay, almost all of you should get to know him. Jay gets this. Jay understands that nutrient pollution is real, that individual decisions contribute to it, but that individual decisions can begin to bend that curve down. He's also very dedicated to this idea that land health matters and it ought to be the pole star that USDA is navigating by. I'd like to think that matches up really well with what we're trying to do at the Environmental Protection Agency. One way that we are trying to encourage and promote this effort, back about 2.5 years ago, our water office in D.C. issued what amounted to a roadmap for action. And the strong preference was for state action that used a whole variety of different tools, scientific research, in some cases, particular kinds of pollution control plans on a certain stream, and lots of technological innovation to get this right. Iowa, this agency sees what we're doing in Iowa as an effort to kind of drive that policy forward. Very supportive of it, definitely willing to put resources into it, but also willing to hold the state to account, because there are things that will happen and could happen if this effort is unsuccessful. Yeah.
Thank you. We met earlier. Thank
Yeah,
you
hi,
for
it's good to see you again.
meeting with the graduate students today
Right.
and for coming to Iowa State. And many of
for
us were
hosting
in
me.
this same room in December when Director Gipp and others presented the nutrient management strategy and held a public forum about that. And I was wondering if you could speak to why the IDNR's plan with the EPA, the work plan, has not yet been signed, and what the timeline is for signing that work plan.
That would be the work plan on non-point source nutrient pollution.
Yes.
What I can tell you is that I don't know that it's specifically a work plan that's going to be reflected in a document that Chuck Gipp and Bill Northey and I sign. Instead, it's going to be a final strategy released by the DNR and by IDALS. I can't give you an exact timing on that, thanks to the several thousand comments that the state got from Iowans all over the state. The authors of that plan are trying to figure out, okay, where are the good ideas? Where are the ideas that we can use to make this work better? Let's knit those into the plan before we go final with it. I don't have a clock ticking on Chuck and on Bill. They know we're interested. I have a strong sense that they want to get that final just as much as the EPA does. So it's not so much a specific work plan as it is a strategy document that the state of Iowa, those two agencies, are responsible for.
Okay, thank you.
I'm from north central Iowa.
Oh,
right down here.
yeah, hi.
I'm from north central Iowa, and up there we have a couple of targeted areas in the Mississippi River Basin Initiative. And just, I know for a couple of years, NRCS and others have been working with farmers on a volunteer basis to reduce nutrients getting into the surface waters. What is your opinion, or how do you view the efforts that have gone on so far? Have they been significantly successful?
You want to define success in ways that are relevant to what you're trying to do here. What, to me, appears to be the most successful right now about the NRCS effort is to identify key watersheds where we want to dedicate our efforts. One of the things that the Environmental Protection Agency has been urging Iowans to do is decide where you're going to put your effort. Decide those watersheds that are good watersheds to promote these practices in, that you'll have substantial return for your investment. Don't spread your efforts completely across the state, across every little creek and slough, but let's focus on some key watersheds. Week, I think, before last, or maybe last week, the state agencies and the federal agencies like EPA and USDA identified 8 major watersheds in the state. We're talking fairly broad gauge watersheds, but 8 out of 25 or 30 potential. That's where the effort's going to go. And the reason I think that we learned that is in part from NRCS's experience, that you have to pick where you're going to go, because changing farming practices and concentrating your resources, it kind of requires a reciprocal effort. So when somebody in the watershed sees another person do something, he shares that. And so also you can do your measurements and monitoring and do some feedback and say, hey, this is working, or we got to rejigger this. It's not working like it should. So the selection of these priority watersheds, it's really crucial. We did not want to just run corner to corner across the state. trying to tackle over, 90,000 farmers and nearly 200,000 different farming operations. Instead, what we wanted to do is focus on places where we could get change to happen, where there were willing leaders, and where we could do the monitoring that allowed us to say this is working well, this is not working so well, this has been a total bust, let's try something different on that. So the selection of priority watersheds, I think, reflects a lot of what we learned from watching NRCS over the last 6 or 8 years. Let's see, I saw another. Yeah,
Director Brooks. Ralph Rosenberg. I represent the Iowa.
Oh, hi, Ralph. Yeah.
Hi, Carl. Welcome to Iowa.
Ralph has the job in Iowa that I held when I was in Idaho. You used to be a state legislator,
Right.
And now you're head of the Iowa
Right.
Environmental Council.
That's right,
I used to be a
Carl.
state legislator, and then I was the head of the Idaho equivalent. So it's great. It's like looking in a mirror at myself. You look better than I did.
It may end shortly after I make one comment, but let's
That's
enjoy it
okay.
for a second. Not every environmental group shares your enthusiasm over the prospects of the strategy. If you read the comments, there's a lot of concerns expressed that the voluntary strategy will fall short. It won't be successful. There's either insufficient money or insufficient attention towards holding the agriculture industry accountable. But you made a couple of interesting comments, and I'm really interested in hearing you express some concerns. You said that there will be a role, or there is a role for EPA if this strategy is unsuccessful. Now, I don't think it's going to work, but I hope it works in one level. I just don't think it's going to work. But I really would like to hear what you're going to do to hold it accountable. And then the next question is, how long are you going to wait? Because I think citizens of Iowa want to know, is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it a year and a half? And then what are some of the things, I know that question might be a little hard today, but it's fair to ask. Maybe hard to answer. But I am interested in what EPA will do to, put leverage or pressure if after 6 months or a year those algae blooms continue, people still going out of state to canoe, drinking water treatment plants continue to get constructed. That's what we want to know. Thanks.
You bet. I can tell you right now that if you've got a 6-month time horizon on whether this effort has worked, I don't think that's the least bit realistic. I mean, it took us decades to reach the position that we're in. We've expended, by some measurements, hundreds of billions of dollars here in the Corn Belt. Some progress has been made, but the challenge is still, like I said, the biggest unsolved water pollution challenge. Ralph, to say in 6 months the agency, whether it's at headquarters or Kansas City Region 7, is going to determine that this effort worked or didn't work, unrealistic. And I'm not going to hold it to that kind of a 6-month clock. Now, we have a system which permits people to encourage the agency to take actions in a variety of different ways. It's entirely possible that someone might try to force that clock just a little bit. The agency right now is a defendant in 3 or 4 different consolidated lawsuits. I believe one set's been consolidated in New York and one set's been consolidated in New Orleans. The effect of those lawsuits is to compel the agency, to compel our state partners to take certain kinds of actions. I know you're well aware of that. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, the agency filed its briefs in both of those cases, which is a considered position of the agency, which said that there is not a mandatory duty under those parts of the Clean Water Act to take the steps that the NGO plaintiffs wanted the agency to take. That was a considered decision to give these state-based efforts, multi-state basin efforts, a chance to work on their own terms. I mean, I don't think the agency took that position lightly. That's an indication that we recognize that this process of trying to align federal agencies with state agencies, number of states with other states, and to try to get thousands of independent producers on private property to begin implementing practices that will bend down that curve is a complex process. There's a lot of parts to it that have to mesh and align. There's going to be feedback loops and check back. So putting some kind of a time clock on it, we're not going to do that right now. measurable, substantial progress. If you read this agency's comment to the DNR and IDALS, which I signed, it says that there will be measurable, substantial reductions in nutrients, but it didn't attach a time clock to it. I mean, really the plea that I've kept sharing and my colleagues keep sharing with everybody involved in this effort, figure out ways to see quickly, because producers have to make decisions pretty much in real time, year by year. What practices work and how well do they work? And get that data back so we can figure out how to adjust it. So there's not a time clock on it. We're committed in these principles that we outlined nearly 2.5 years ago to work with the states, to partner with other federal agencies, and to withhold some of those powers that are available under the Clean Water Act to get these other efforts a chance to work.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I grew up on a classic Iowa diversified farm in the 40s and 50s. We raised everything, all kinds of livestock, a lot of crops, which resulted in a lot of crop rotation. We rotated grain, hay, corn, soybeans. I think we probably made a few mistakes then, but I think we might be making more now. Now, actually, I did go to Iowa State, but not in ag. I was a civil engineer, and I'm a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, which we have a long code that we follow, so we do try to protect the environment. I worked as a civil engineer for a number of years, and also I've been a tree farmer for the last 20 years. Now, my brother and I have inherited the old family farm. Now I'm in the trenches. I've been working with the NRCS, which they've got all the forms and sometimes have a little money. And what I've been able to do so far is establish a buffer strip. And now this year I'm working with cover crops. But it is very difficult to get the technical information I need. The NRCS people they do the best they can, but I'm not sure if they have enough training, if they have enough staff. And then to add to the problem, one of my renters thought my buffer strip was weeds, and he volunteered to destroy it for me. But anyway, we got that straightened out, and he's no longer my renter. But I look around, and the only real help I can get, technical help, I've had some seminars by the Practical Farmers of America. I know ISU is doing a lot of stuff. They have a lot of publications. But I have to rely on a guy about 6 miles away that's trying some of the same things that I am. And I look at my neighbors, they're not doing anything. And it's very frustrating. I'm in the trenches, and I sympathize with those people in Louisiana because I worked there for a couple months a number of years ago. But it's just very frustrating. It seems like we need more technical information, and we need to get people motivated, especially these absentee landowners. So that's my experience from being in the trenches.
Thanks for sharing that. If I were Dean Winterstein and I heard someone beg for more technical information, that to me is a bugle cry for the land-grant institution to leap into action. That's one of the strengths of the land-grant enterprise, is the sharing of these kinds of efforts that are investigated and pioneered on campus with operators throughout the state. One of the things I might suggest that you do, even before you leave this evening, is Matt Helmer still in the room, or Tom Eisenhart? You guys raise your hand, Eisenhart, and yeah. This gentleman wants to visit with you guys afterwards for just a couple of minutes about how to get some technical information to promote some of these practices that I know are at the basis of the scientific assessment. So, sir, if you would talk to Professor Helmers and Professor Eisenhart for just a couple of minutes before you leave the room, I think you'd probably get some better links up to the kind of info that it sounds like you're really eager to use. And I'd say, stick with it, because that kind of persistence, your neighbors are going to notice that you're a persistent SOB after a while. Because I think you probably are, I can tell. Yeah.
Hello. In the short span of time between when I was a child and today, A lot has actually happened. Where we used to fish, I would no longer eat those fish, and where my father taught us to swim, I would no longer swim or wade in those waters. Here in Iowa, we have now 628 impaired waterways. We have over 800 documented manure spills. Documented. We here in Story County have 80 CAFOs, and many counties have a lot more than Story County. In Iowa, we have over 8,000 CAFOs. So it's no wonder that our land and our water, vital resources, are being compromised at alarming rates. We Iowans need you, Dr. Brooks, to have courage to make some really strong changes.
Well, thanks. I didn't hear a question in there, but what I thought I might do is sort of just spin that into just a little bit of a question here. One of the reasons that I tried to do just a little bit of kind of environmental legal history for you on the Clean Water Act and the distinction between point sources and non-point sources, and the distinction between confined animal feeding operations and other kinds of agricultural operations, is to emphasize that the program that this agency has been carrying out for decades now in Iowa with the DNR's assistance to try to manage pollutants from these large confined feeding operations has been a success. The program is not finished by a long shot, and one of the goals that the DNR and EPA Region 7 have is to make that CAFO program better, because there are facilities that do not have permits now that need to be evaluated for whether they do need permits, because a permit has been shown to be a good way to control the kinds of pollutants that these operations can discharge into Iowa's waters. I mean, we may disagree about what the evidence shows. Nobody, I think, here can say that these kinds of operations, if not managed consistently with the law, can be environmental threats and have been proven to be environmental threats. That's why we work so hard with the DNR and with responsible leaders in the livestock industry to make the permit system work right. Because a Clean Water Act permit has been one of the best tools shown over the last 40 years to control pollutants. The challenge in Iowa is still substantial, in part because you guys have so darn much water. Us Kansans, we Kansans, look enviously at the amount of water that flows off this state into the two great rivers. You take a look at 2/3 of Kansas, 2/3 of Nebraska. They're essentially getting on toward deserts or near deserts. You guys are blessed with productive soil and a lot of water. It's one of the reasons why you got the challenges that you got here. Yes, sir. Okay, one last? Okay.
Hi, my name's Ron.
Hi, Ron.
I grew up on a family farm, and I live about a quarter of a mile from the muddy Des Moines River. It has been a muddy Des Moines River ever since I was a little kid fishing in it, and it hasn't changed, probably gotten worse. Anyway, my comment is you talk about wanting to collaborate with different Iowa farmers and state agencies and so forth. Well, back about 20 years ago, when DeCoster Farms came into Iowa, a bunch of farmers and I organized a group called Organization for Protection of the Environment. We had people who had checked out DeCoster when he was in Maine. We had notified, I shouldn't say we, all of us, some of the members had notified state officials as to what DeCoster was like, what kind of violations he had in other places. We had one farmer who was a hog farmer who, from Mason City area, flew over DeCoster Farms facility, took a picture of him, their facility pumping manure directly into the stream. He notified the DNR.
Sir.
The DNR did not do anything.
Sir.
And
could you start leading toward the question, please? I want
that's
to be
what I'm getting to. My
respectful of
question
everybody.
is,
okay, thanks.
We were people who were concerned about what was going on many years ago. We met with government officials. We basically were listened to, but that was it. What I'm saying is, if you want to have true collaboration, shouldn't you involve other people like these farmer members who had these concerns and could have probably prevented some of the problems that DeCoster brought into the state? rather than ignoring us?
Without knowing hardly anything about the specifics of the DeCoster matter you're talking about, one of the goals that the agency, EPA, has had in this nutrient control strategy is to give ordinary Iowans, both those who farm and ranch as well as Iowans who care about the state and the quality of the waters, adequate opportunities to make this strategy better, to test the strategy against what they know about their own neighborhoods, apply their own practical knowledge to it. We were pleased that the state agencies had a really pretty big, wide public comment process. Over 2,000 Iowans chose to comment, some in person, some online and in writing. I'm fairly satisfied that with Iowa State's help, both the DNR and IDALS will take those comments very seriously, use them to improve the plan before it becomes a final strategy. And I'm convinced one of the reasons that Iowa is such an important place for EPA to work is that people here take citizenship seriously. Iowans epitomize responsibility. People expect their neighbors to play by the rules and to take account of what happens beyond their fence line. It's one of the reasons why I've heard somebody say the difference between an optimist and a person who's hopeful is that an optimist thinks things will be better even though there may not be evidence of that. A person who's hopeful believes that it's better to have the attitude that things will improve instead of to be negative about everything. I'm going to go ahead and say that EPA's attitude is hopeful, that this effort really works, that it engages with the problem. And one of the reasons that we hope that it will succeed is that Iowa agricultural leaders from this college campus right out through the main groups in the state acknowledge that there is a nutrient pollution problem, that it extends beyond the boundaries of the state, and that it requires decisive action to begin to solve it. Those are substantial recognitions, and like I said earlier, I do not underestimate the importance of those. So I think Joe said we're about out of time here. I want to thank very much the College of Agriculture, the student government of the Iowa State University, and all of you for traveling here this evening to come and listen to me. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks.
Thanks, Joe.